Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar through CAWRI, the Creativity and Wellbeing Research Initiative here at the University of Melbourne. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of lands on which I am at the moment, which are the lands of the Boonwurrung peoples, but also the Wurundjeri people are also on the University of Melbourne lands. And I wish to pay our respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge that the lands on which we are sitting have never been ceded, and they were the lands of the Wurundjeri and the Boonwurrung, the Eastern Kulin nations, long before any of us were ever here. So many generations of people understanding the climate, living with the climate, and the conditions that throws at us in the harshness of the Australian landscape, and very timely that we should have a conversation today based on some research undertaken by two very well-known researchers in the field. So Claire Hooker from the University of Sydney and Anna Kennedy-Borissow, who is from the University of Melbourne. So what I'm going to do is hand over to Claire, who will begin, and then she will pass on to Anna, as they've been working as a little bit of a team. So thank you very much, Claire, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Jane, and to all of you joining us online. Lovely to have a conversation in this area. I'm just going to share my screen in the time-honoured manner. As Jane mentioned, Anna and I have been working together, just exploring and setting a background for this proposition about arts and cultural activity being crucial to disaster management. And I also would like to add my acknowledgement of country. I'm joining from Gundungurra and Darug country today, and this image taken by local photographer Gary P. Hayes has to be one of the most penultimate images of hopeful recovery, being the extraordinary pink flannel flowers that bloomed all around the country that I'm joining you from as an aftermath of the utterly devastating destruction of bushfire in the summer of 2019 and 2020. So all I want to offer today is a background of thinking about arts and cultural activity in relation to disaster management. And this comes, of course, in something I don't really need to set out, and I don't want to work through the detail on this particular slide, but only to say that in the current climate emergency and here in Australia, the urgency of disaster management and of doing things a bit differently rather than being responsive only to each disaster event is more and more apparent. There is a lot of research in the disaster management space, and it tends to identify these 3 points that I've put up here on the slide: the significance of these 4 C's in good quality disaster management practice, the fact that a lot of this comes down and centres on what happens at the local level, that community self-determination, community-led solutions are really important, and that in turn makes it all the more important that there's a sort of whole community approach to disaster management that becomes something that is part of community development. And in particular, that there are equity and inclusion issues. Why would we think that arts and cultural activity and creative activity might be a predictor of improved disaster management, or that there might be a case to be made for the centrality or the importance of these things as part of disaster management? Well, I'm preaching to the converted here. So again, I really don't want to be spending very much time on making this particular case, but it's a case that probably needs to be made outside our own inner circles in the arts and health space. And the major background to this case is the exponential expansion of research literature around the proposition that the arts are really beneficial for health and well-being. I have chosen to pull out a recent research, I'm going to call it a research dump. So this is from March 2023, when what was formerly known as the WHO Collaborating Centre for Arts and Health at University College London, now known as the Social and Biobehavioural Research Group, released the outcomes of more than 80 studies undertaken on a huge data set that allowed longitudinal cohort studies to explore these connections between arts and cultural engagement, links to health and well-being at the population level. This same group identified over 600 mechanisms in the research literature that would connect arts and cultural engagement with particular health and well-being outcomes. The cohort studies look at these across the life course. And whether you take either of those two perspectives, or you take those that are coming more from a sort of critical humanities orientation, critical studies perspective, there are a lot of ways in which we now understand and have an abundance of evidence, both qualitative and quantitative, to suggest something that, you know, we all kind of have known intuitively, or that reach back into a long research history in community cultural development. And of course, are taken forward by our First Nations colleagues all around the world, that creativity and cultural activity have these huge impacts at health and well-being levels, and that they often center on such things as what happens in early childhood, the capacity for the arts to create forms of social connection, on the capacity of arts and culture to generate agency, self-determination, and to underpin connectivity and inclusion amongst different categories of people. And I'll just give a special shout out here to the recent publication of the outcomes of a large linkage project, which provides another really fabulous set of ways of thinking about this in the context very specifically of communities that are very disaster impacted in Australia, which are regional communities. And the social impact model developed here has these 4 dimensions of collective well-being, thriving community, amplified place, and creative ecology that I think usefully extend the arts and health way of thinking about these things. And overall, this is an image from a group that I work with in Lithgow, Outer Blue Mountains. One of the critical and very simple things that arts and cultural activities do is just create an ability to engage with people, create the conditions for engagement, where that engagement is increasingly difficult to obtain due to the economic and social factors that really limit people's capacity to have time and energy for that sort of additional engagement beyond the day-to-day routines of their lives. So the summary of the rationale of what I'm talking about today is that we know that there's a lot of need in terms of disaster management, that improved disaster management is predicted by primarily relational factors, that we know that from this disaster management literature, that self-determination is really important. Resilience, of course, very ambivalent term, something to unpack, but often denoting some of what I've just said in those previous slides. And then we've got all this evidence that arts and cultural practice are fundamental to well-being, connection, self-determination. And we know that after any disaster event, recovery packages usually fund a whole pile of arts projects. And why is there a good rationale for that? What are we getting out of that? How are people feeling about that? When is that done well? These are all the questions that don't have a research literature behind them, and that might be helpful to engage with in order to do those things more and better and more deliberatively moving forward. And I'd just like to acknowledge at this point that many of the images that I am accompanied these slides with come from local Blue Mountains artists. I've identified the names of the artists and their titles. There's a few also from my colleague Vic McEwen at the CAD Factory. And all of these images are shared with permission and are publicly available in most cases. And particular shout out to the work of Caitlin Hepworth, a fabulous local mosaicist who did an enormous body of work in the outcome of the 2013 bushfires, which destroyed her house and her entire collection of works to date, and led to a different kind of series about artworks and outcomes. So the proposition is arts and culture should be a prominent part of disaster management practice and research, but there isn't much research literature to support that. Research literature is needed for all of these things. So where we started is to find out what is in the published literature already. Anna was doing this as part of her PhD research because that's what one does. And I set out to do that as a first step, survey the literature in a systematic way strategy, because that's what I would do in a public health context. And Anna and I have joined forces in order to make sure that that literature review is done to the most rigorous standard that we could possibly achieve, and in ways that would potentially satisfy various audiences, whether they be part of government agencies or in the public health arena or in the arts performance studies, arts scholarship arena, or in the disaster management arena. So that's the kind of rationale for why the process occurred as it did. And all I'm going to do is tell you what this literature review looks like so far, and just advanced warning that it is pretty light on implications and conclusions because I haven't thought through those yet. But Anna might take that forward in her part of the conversation. So what were our research questions? What impacts of arts and cultural activities have been identified in the context of disaster management? What's been published? And what methods and methodologies have been used to generate this evidence base? And just so you know, here is where we drew our definitions from. We followed as systematic process as possible, and we are showing this in this particular diagram. Our data extraction included citation details, the aims of each study, methodology, the different art forms, locations, types of disaster, and summary of outcomes. And what I haven't included in this presentation is some of the tables that show these things, but they were really quite interesting actually in terms of those sets of findings. And then we did an iterative inductive thematic analysis to really synthesize what turned out, of course, to be really diverse literature set. Here is an overall image of that inductive thematic analysis. So there are these two dominant themes here that intersect, one around what we labeled experience catching, because any of the other labels seemed a little too embedded in one particular disciplinary orientation rather than another. And these linked primarily to these themes of sense making and psychological recovery, but also were connected with some of these themes about connecting with particular equity groups or including particular marginalized groups, children in particular. And the other large theme, which you might expect, was labeled social capital, all of the ways in which arts and cultural activities generated forms of social connection, benefits from those forms of social connection, which link particularly to these two themes and also down to these. But the other interesting aspect of this is that there was a fairly substantial group of studies that identified what we've labeled as critical perspectives. So when I use the term critical, this comes from critical studies literatures, that is, studies that were very critical of and attentive to issues of injustice, inequality, and imbalances of power. And they, of course, touch on all aspects of those different themes. So all I'm going to do is talk through these one by one extremely briefly. Experience catching as a theme obviously was defined as articles that were concerned with reporting on the phenomenology and experience of disasters. These studies generally started from the position that giving expression to experience, in particular to aspects of experience that were not easily represented or not best represented verbally, these things were considered to be either intrinsically good or important just in and of themselves, or beneficial as a means of processing distress. And this links obviously to the theme of psychological recovery. Experience was caught at both individual and collective levels, and it's at this way that it tended to overlap or intersect with the theme of social capital and the benefits of doing that. This theme included a number of studies in which the arts were a method of research effectively. Mostly they were not considered formally as arts-based research methods in the way we're now used to, but primarily the objective of these sets of studies were that the arts were used to understand the experience rather than the community using the arts to capture or to represent or to hold that experience in some ways. Some of these studies deliberately selected art forms that were very, very close to people's experience without a big representational gap. So some of these were things like documentary theatre art forms, or a process such as cultural animation that were able to undertake those. And the cultural animation approach explicitly addressed that epistemic theme where if the arts or the artistic methods were used for the purposes of exploring aspects of experience, that produced epistemic outcomes that were relevant not only for researchers, but for participants and for communities on their own terms. Linked to this was a number of articles that were explicitly devoted to meaning making in relation to disasters. And these included a subset of articles that reported personal, moral, or spiritual growth after disaster. Not unexpectedly, there was a quite large theme of psychological recovery. We thought for some time about whether to exclude or leave in the subset of 13 articles that were essentially art therapy articles. And we've leaned towards including those. It's not obviously what we did not do is a literature review in any sense, or a systematic review of data or evidence about the impacts of art therapy per se, but our literature search strategy did include or did capture 13 articles that were self-described as reporting on art therapy outcomes. A number of these were explicitly concerned with how arts engagements can help with trauma as a very specific construct, and a larger number were reported benefits about specifically creating a sense of safety after disaster. Again, none of this will be unsurprising. Social capital was a very, very large theme and might be deserving of being split into some of its sub-themes, including very specifically a whole set of sub-themes around identity. And these tended to be articles that emphasized how arts and cultural activities brought people to emphasize or recreate shared identity, or to generate forms of community or cultural identity, and those that reported personal identity being validated or re-established through these particular forms of engagement. Not the same as this, but again, intersecting were a set of articles that investigated or were strongly concerned with issues of equity and disaster management, particularly considering how specified social groups, are a few particularly around women, often in global South settings, about how these groups are or are not included in disaster management, and how using creative or cultural activities might ensure that they are. And we coded some of these around justice or equity, and sometimes just one or the other of those, depending on what the focus of those articles were. These were labelled often with specific social groups. So, and the ones that came up aside from children and youth were women, Indigenous people, and older people, with only a couple in each of those different categories. There were actually quite a substantial group of articles that we applied our label children to, and these should really be regarded as children and youth. So unsurprisingly, the arts and cultural or creative activities were seen as a primary way to engage with these groups of people, either to allow them to express some aspects of their experience or their journeys through recovery, or to use as a research tool that would be a reasonable way to engage with them. Sometimes these articles did report on times when these groups would express a desire to either not to engage with issues around the experience of disaster, or to put those aside, or to take matters into their own hands in terms of thinking about the way in which they would prefer to re-envisage those the future. These articles often did reflect a couple of concentrated research groups. One of those is, the Te Rito Toi and sets of groups both around in Auckland and in Christchurch, and so came out of very specific disaster events. We had a separate label for education. These were articles that explored arts and culture either as a means of doing what in the public health world we would refer to as health communication or health promotion, that is explicitly educating communities about disaster management. Nearly all of those were Global South studies, or that were situated primarily in a school setting. We use these sublabels to explore these themes. Last two groups, articles that reported on placemaking, otherwise literally being about rebuilding and recreating landscape and environment. So these were usually not about sense making and not about community rebuilding, but actually very specifically about the details of literally recreating devastated places. Some of these were, of course, focused specifically on building place identity. And there was a really small subset of articles that were simply interested in discussing how arts, cultural, or creativity could be utilised to facilitate economic recovery or economic redevelopment. And sometimes this would come out of the act of literal rebuilding in communities. Now, around all of these themes was this issue of critical perspectives, and these were defined as articles that investigated or used a perspective primarily or strongly influences by issues of power or politics and drawn from critical theory. So these largely saw that disasters were the outcomes of systems and processes that generated systematic forms of discrimination and oppression, and that worsened these things in the context of the experience of disaster or the rebuilding after it. We applied the additional subcode of neoliberalism to a set of articles where this framework was explicitly raised and used to understand why disaster experiences were so bad, and to critique how disaster management was occurring in those particular contexts. And in these situations, the creative arts are, as it were, positioned and framed as oppositional to those very destructive systems and processes that were identified as causally related to the existence and the experiences and dimensions of disasters. So that's what's in the literature. And there's a lot more detail hidden under all of those labels. Perhaps Anna will take those forward. How are we going to make sense of this? What are we going to do with this? How can this be utilised moving forward? What does this give us as the basis of a research agenda for arts and cultural activity in relation to disaster management? Well, some of this might be taken forward using the cultural capital orientation in the Recovery Capitals framework. An example of how this might look might come from the Fire to Flourish, which is a First Nations-led framework. You can see that these particular headings map more or less onto some of the themes that we've identified. It wouldn't be hard to map the connections between this set here and the themes that came out of our literature review. It similarly would not be hard to take the themes from our literature review and map them into the 4 directions that were identified in the impact assessment framework for how arts and cultural activity is important in regional communities from the Queensland study. And likewise, there's obviously really important connections to, actually, I think I have this on the next slide, to Aboriginal First Nations ways of knowing, being and doing. And this sort of framework is utilised obviously in Maori context and in Canadian First Nation context also, with not dissimilar categories where we can see arts and cultural activities being not only central, but also facilitators of each of these modes. It's also similarly aligns with the traditional concerns and causal explanations that we ran over really quickly in relation to arts and health, and the much longer 40, 50-year traditions of community cultural development. I've always liked the AIDS quilt as an exemplification of where these things come together. In the traditions of radical commitments within the history of public health and health promotion, and those radical commitments in the community cultural development space, those two things ran in parallel tracks in the past, but those orientations remain really powerfully connected to a lot of the aspirations that underpinned the studies that were published that we found as part of this literature review. And then I think that we would want to carry forward in thinking about how this guides us both to pragmatic considerations that might underpin or drive resource allocation and planning and development, and aspirational considerations or principle-based considerations for what might underpin the way we think about this field and the way that thinking takes the field forward as we move forward.